While nearly all in the GOP today call themselves Reagan Republicans, and I don't think anybody's ever met anybody who calls himself a Gerald Ford Republican, this was not always so. Reagan was never beloved by all in his party until after the announcement of the Alzheimer's and his subsequent death. And in this there is a danger. Too many have tried to shoehorn their own philosophy into Reaganism so as to justify their own goals. Just several months ago, George Bush's Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson spoke at the Reagan Library and tried to argue that his and Bush's unprecedented takeover of banks and other lending institutions was some form of Reaganism. I think that we would all agree that's utterly ridiculous. Others went on television to proclaim unequivocally during the heated debate over the TARP bailout scheme that Reagan would have supported Bush's plan. Now, while I cannot sit here and tell you categorically that Reagan would not have supported it, I think we all agree it would be reckless to do so. I can tell you with equal conviction that there is far more evidence that Reagan would have opposed it than supported it. The danger and the lack of knowledge is that too many see Reagan through the prism of their own ambitions. But I think we should let Reagan speak for himself. In 1980, he was asked by a reporter of the New York Times about his view of government. Reagan said with simplicity and sagacity, quote, "My view of the role of government is that it is to protect us from each other. The role of government is not to protect us from ourselves." Of course, we all know he had a sense of humor. While governor, he was once confronted by a smelly hippie. And maybe it was Bill Clinton, I don't know. The hippie was carrying a sign that said, "Make love, not war." Reagan looked at the sign of the hippie and turned to an aide and says, "You know, from the looks of him, I don't think he could do either." By the time he decided to take on Gerald Ford in 1976, while half of the GOP would have followed him to the ends of the earth, the other half wanted to throw him off a cliff. 1976 was the first time since 1952, and the last time in American politics, when delegates gathered into Convention City, not knowing who would be the nominee of their party. Summoning up the titanic struggle for the nomination between Ford and Reagan, the New York Times opined, quote, "There have been many dramatic battles over presidential nominations in the past, but never in modern times has there been anything like this. A sitting president, 2 years in office, being challenged to within an inch of his political life by the opposition inside of his own party. It seemed almost impossible that with all the advantages of incumbency and none of the disadvantages of personal scandal, this president could in fact lose the nomination as well as control of his party and the convention." This editorial appeared the morning after Ford barely, just barely, defeated Reagan for the nomination in Kansas City, winning by a scant 57 votes out of 2,257 cast the night before. The animosity, in case you think otherwise, between Ford and Reagan was both evident and deep. During the heat of the campaign, during the Michigan primary, Ford quipped, Reagan and I both played football. I played for Michigan and he played for Warner Brothers. When reporters told Reagan of Ford's remark, he thought about it and he says, "Well, at least I played football with a helmet." Now, at this point, I'd like to show you Reagan's comments in Kansas City after losing to Ford, because I think they're very important to the launch of actually the 1980 campaign. Thank you, Steve. That is Thursday, the last night of the convention in Kansas City. Ford has won the nomination. Reagan had just given an interview in his skybox to Tom Brokaw, and Brokaw asked him, "Are you going to address the convention, Governor?" He says, "No." And then at the very last moment, now it was quite somewhat of a setup by the Ford people because they wanted to bring Reagan down. Ford had used a teleprompter at practice. They had professional joke writers working with him and all this. Yeah, it was the best political speech Ford ever gave. But the one thing the Ford people did not want is for Reagan to address the convention before the delegates actually voted. They were just terrified that all hell would break loose and Reagan would take over the convention. But having won the nomination, now they need to unify the party. So they asked Reagan to come down, and it's all on national television. Sam was there. He was reporting on that night for ABC, and as I recall, you said the first excitement of the evening wasn't for Ford, it was for the man who wasn't on the ticket. Some of that, words to that effect. But it is, in a way, it's a setup. Now, here's Reagan. He says no time to prepare a speech. There's no teleprompter. There's no prepared remarks. He thinks he's not going to, and now the Ford family is all on national television, waving in front of ABC, NBC, and CBS, millions of people watching, 17,000 people in Kemper Arena, and now he's got to walk down there and give a speech. And as he's walking down, he says to Mike Deaver, he says, Mike, what am I going to say? And Deaver says, Governor, you'll think of something. This speech is one of the most important, as far as I'm concerned, in his lifetime, probably only after the 1964 speech for Goldwater, whereas 64 launched his political career. This speech actually launched the 1980 campaign. A woman who was a Ford delegate from Florida was on the floor, watched Reagan's remarks, and she exclaimed, "Oh my God, we've nominated the wrong man." The centrality of the story of Reagan's seemingly quixotic but most important campaign is that though he lost, he laid the groundwork for his successful revolution in 1980. Had he not run and lost in 1976, he would never have run in 1980. Reagan would have become a small footnote in the history books. Had he not run in 1976, the GOP may well have died off and been replaced by a new third political party. Had he not run in 1976, the party, if it survived, would have remained a Tory-like party in which the status quo is always defended, where power flows downward. Reagan changed the Republican Party to an American-style populist party in which power flows upward and the status quo is always questioned. After his loss in Kansas City, though Reagan was in the wilderness, they were productive years for him. He led the fight against the Panama Canal treaties. He adopted tax cuts and budget cuts as his signature issues. He began the process of assembling the GOP into the fusionist party centered upon his organizing philosophy of freedom. By 1980, leadership was no mystery to Reagan. An observer of President Carter and Reagan said at the time, if you ask Jimmy Carter what time it is, he'd tell you how to build a watch. And if you ask Ronald Reagan what time it is, he'd tell you it's time to get this country moving again. The 1980 campaign would prove to be one of the four most important national plebiscites in history, along with 1800, 1860, and 1932, because in each election, a startling choice and direction was offered to the American people. As he was leaving office in 1989, even his old nemesis, the Washington Post, was compelled to observe, quote, Ronald Reagan has absolutely confounded prediction. Today, at the age of 77, he relinquishes the office so many thought he could never get, being, it was said 8 years ago, too old, too ideological, too conservative, too poorly informed, too politically marginal. In short, too out of it. But there he is, going out in a rare end-of-term surge of good feeling. His critics on key issues, we are emphatically among them, still at a loss as to how to assess and finally even understand the man. Facts alone should help lay to rest the intellectual condescension with which so many of his political wrestling partners and victims have discussed him. It's not enough to say this pleasant actor and his canny handlers somehow gulled a nation of 240 million people for 8 years. Something much more substantive occurred than just PR. He has helped to make this a stronger country abroad and a different one at home. Mr. Reagan has left a powerful imprint on American politics. His was a consequential presidency. Reagan became president in 1981, and he changed the Republican Party, he changed America, and he changed the world. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you.